a 30-day Godot challenge. And I'm going to show you how I launch skulls. Alas, poor York, I hardly knew ye. I didn't have a skull for that prop, so I used an old Kylo Ren helmet. That's besides the point. Let's get into the project. I'm going to show you how I launch skulls in this game. So, a sentence I never thought I'd say, but here we are. So I'll just show you what it looks like right now. So, if you're standing still, you push the shoot button, you can launch a skull. You have to collect the skull in order to shoot again. So, I'm standing here. So if I'm standing still and I'm facing the other direction, I can shoot a skull that way. If I'm moving, I shoot a skull, it goes in the direction I'm moving. If I'm up in the air and I launch a skull, it goes down. You cannot launch a skull up. So that's, oh yeah, and then if you're in the air and you're moving in that direction, it'll launch the skull in that direction. So if up, boom, there's that. If I'm up in the air and I'm moving this way, I can launch the skull this way. And then we'll hide from the skull for a little bit. If for whatever reason I can't collect the skull within 10 seconds, the skull automatically goes away and goes back to the player. So that's what I worked on. All in all, it was quite a bit more complicated, but it works well. I think it works well. Why that skull just bounced and I didn't collect it in time, I'll go over. So, we'll hop into the skull real quick. It's a rigid body 2D. We'll hop into its code real quick because it's very simple. So, it has a respawn time. This is the time it takes for it to be not attached to the player before it decides, okay, bring me back to the player. So, and then on timer timeout, it sends a signal to this function, skull release. So it gets the player, sets a variable the player has called has skull to true, and then it queue free, it goes away. So then on ready, it just sets the queue free timer wait time to spawn time. So that way, if I change this variable, I don't ever have to change it here. I don't have to change this node ever. And then auto start. So it auto starts when the skull enters the scene, it auto starts. So I can change this to 5 seconds and I don't have to worry about changing it here. It's just a little bit of peace of mind for me. I like to change the variables and I don't have to worry about if I need to change something, I need to figure out, oh, what node was that was attached to, or what was happening there. So for me, it's just easier. So player, I'm going to go over this real quick. So, here it is. So this is my launch skull function. This is what happens when the player will start all the way down here from firing skull. So this is the controls for actually shooting the skull. So first off, if the player has a skull, make sure you're playing the idle animation with them that has the skull. And then it's if you're placing left and you push the shoot button, launch the skull left. If you're pressing right and if you're going right and you press the shoot button, launch the skull right. If you're not on the floor, so in the air, launch the skull down. If you are on the floor and you're not moving, so if you're on the floor and you're not hitting left or right, if the animated sprite is flipped, launch it left, because I only flip the sprite if you're facing left. Else, which means you're facing right, launch the skull right. This is if you're standing completely still. And then if you don't have the skull, I'm just going to change this because this is confusing the heck out of me. Okay. So if you don't have the skull, wait 0.4 seconds. And then do skull recovery. This prevents, when the player launches the skull, this prevents them from immediately picking it back up. So, what is skull recovery? Skull recovery, just all this does is it gets the skull position, and it gets the player position, and it tells me the distance. And then it checks to see if the distance between the player and the skull is within 100 pixels. And then if it is, it gives the skull back to the player, and then it gets rid of the skull, and then it changes the animation back to idle. So what happens when you launch the skull, when you actually shoot? So what happens is that it has a speed variable. what happens is, depending on the direction parameter, it knows to add speed to change the velocity for the skull to go left, to go right, or to go down. And how it changes that is it sets the skull's linear velocity to the skull velocity, which I'm changing here. So that sounded complicated in my head. So what happens is I want to fire the skull left. So it changes the skull velocity to the negative skull speed, because to go left, you have to go in the negative x direction. So if I want to go right, I need to go in the positive x direction. So velocity x equals skull speed in the x direction. And then if I want to go down, skull velocity.y equals skull speed, because to go down is positive y, to go up is negative y. And then it sets up a method, it calls a method to set the linear velocity of the rigid body 2D, which is what the skull is, to skull speed. I'm hoping that's not too complicated, but this was getting this shooting function to work the way I wanted to was kind of a lot of thinking. It was a ton of thinking. So, and then let's just hop back into the game real quick, because one thing that was a happy accident, I was playing around with the rigid body 2D settings and I saw bouncy. So the fact that it bounces and I can like gather it back up is awesome, because it means I can do things like this. It means that if there were enemies in a line, I could just spam it, it would bounce off, and I could collect the skull again. So I thought that was really cool, that you could like dribble your own skull and have it bounce off objects. So that's where I'm at right now. What I learned is a ton. But mostly I learned, I learned about distance 2. I didn't know about distance 2 before. I learned more about when to play animations, because I normally had an animate function. I think in a couple videos back I had an animate function that was going to handle all my animations, but what happened is it wasn't switching at the right time. It would be like, it'd have to go through like a frame or go to the next frame to switch it. So I figured out that when I switch animations, I need to do it at the exact time. I can't just call a function. So I probably could just call a function, but it's just easier for me to just insert the animation there. So that's the game so far. I think the player's pretty much dialed in for everything it needs to do. Anything else is minor tweaks to like movement or how the skull works and all that. I think the player's there. So they're enough for me to move on to other things outside the player. Okay, so that's it for this part of the video. So that's day 23 done. For day 24, I want to start working on the start menu. Something simple. The start menu is just going to be the start button that you click on and it'll load the tutorial level. For the tutorial level, although it's not Godot related, I'm going to be working on a paper prototype for that level. If you're unfamiliar with what a paper prototype is, it's exactly what it sounds like. I lay out the level on a piece of paper. There's a lot of benefits to this. Mainly, it lets me get the idea out on paper, and I can tweak things and see if things are going to work in my mind before I actually have to go into the game engine and make it. I look forward to doing that. Hopefully look forward to seeing it, and have a good day or night or whenever you're watching this. Have a good one. Bye.
And if I make a mistake, it's called education. I try to do this every day, call it replication.